$152,000. That's what my mother-in-law stole from my husband and me. Not borrowed, not invested and lost, stolen, dollar by dollar, wire transfer by wire transfer, forged signature by forged signature, while she sat across the dinner table from me every single Sunday and told me my cooking was disgusting. I used to think those were two separate humiliations, the money and the insults. It took me 14 months of digging through bank statements, LLC filings, and a storage unit in Scottsdale, Arizona, to understand they were the same crime. She thought if she made me small enough, quiet enough, ashamed enough of the one thing I was actually good at, I'd never look closely enough to see what she was doing with our money. She was almost right. They thought they got away with it. They were wrong. My name is Jenna. This is the story of how I turned a family dinner into a courtroom, how a woman who called my cooking an insult to the family name ended up in front of a federal judge, and how I got every single dollar back, plus interest, plus restitution, plus something I didn't expect at all. Stay with me to the end, because the twist in this story isn't the theft, it's what she actually did with the money. Before I go further, let me say this plainly. Today's story is about greed, betrayal, and a woman who mistook her daughter-in-law for an easy mark. It's about the quiet financial abuse that happens inside families, the kind banks don't flag, the kind police don't take seriously at first, the kind that hides behind holiday dinners and birthday cards. If you've ever had a family member who made you feel small right before asking you for money, this story is for you. If this is your first time here, I tell true financial revenge stories every week. Fraud, embezzlement, elder scams, affinity fraud, the whole ugly catalog of ways people steal from the people who trust them. Subscribe, hit the bell, because next week's story involves a church treasurer and $2.3 million that vanished over 11 years. Now, let's go back to the beginning, because before there was a scam, there was a dinner table. My husband Mark and I got married in 2018. I was 31. I'd spent the previous 6 years working my way up through restaurant kitchens in Denver, line cook, sous chef, eventually kitchen manager at a mid-sized bistro downtown. Cooking wasn't a hobby for me. It was a craft I'd bled for, literally, in the form of burn scars up both forearms that I still have today. Mark is an electrical engineer. Steady job, steady paycheck, not the kind of man who takes big risks, which is part of why what happened still doesn't make sense to some of our friends. But family, especially a mother, has a way of getting past the defenses a smart, cautious man builds for everyone else. Diane, my mother-in-law, was 64 when I met her, widowed 8 years earlier, lived alone in a townhouse outside Phoenix. On paper, she was unremarkable, a retired dental hygienist with a modest pension, a woman who played bridge on Thursdays and posted a lot of inspirational quotes on Facebook. What she was underneath that surface took me years to fully understand. The first time Diane tasted my cooking was Thanksgiving, 5 months into dating Mark. I made a brined turkey, a cornbread dressing with sage and andouille, a pecan pie from scratch. I'd been cooking professionally for years at that point. I was proud of that meal. Diane took one bite of the dressing, set down her fork, and said in front of 11 people, "Well, it's certainly seasoned." I laughed it off. Mark apologized privately later. "He's just particular," he said. I believed him. I wanted to believe him because I wanted this family to like me. That was the first data point in a pattern I wouldn't fully recognize for 6 more years. Every family dinner after that, and there were dozens, birthdays, Easters, 4th of July barbecues, random Sunday suppers, Diane found something to say. My braised short ribs were too rich. My risotto was gluey. My homemade pasta was not like real Italian food, but that's all right, dear. She never yelled. She never made a scene loud enough for anyone to call rude. It was always delivered with a small, sad smile, like she was doing me a kindness by pointing out my failures. That smile is something I think about constantly now because I now understand it as a tool, a very deliberate one. Here's what I missed at the time, and what I want you to really sit with because I promise someone watching this recognizes it. Consistent, public, gentle criticism of the thing you're proudest of isn't really about the thing. It's about control. It's about making sure you never feel confident enough, competent enough, or trusted enough to question anything else that person does. I spent years trying to win Diane's approval with better food, better recipes, more expensive ingredients. I once spent $400 and 11 hours making a coq au vin from a Julia Child recipe for her 70th birthday. She ate 2 bites and told my sister-in-law it was a bit much. I didn't know it then, but I was being trained to doubt myself, trained to defer, trained to not ask hard questions about a woman who clearly had strong, confident opinions about everything, including, eventually, our money. Looking back now, with the paper trail sitting in a banker's box in my office, I can point to at least 6 moments in those first few years that should have told me something was wrong with Diane long before the money disappeared. Red flag 1. Diane never talked specifics about her own finances. When asked directly, she'd deflect. Oh, retirement's not what it used to be. But she also drove a new Lexus every 3 years and took 2 international trips annually on a dental hygienist's pension. Nobody in the family did that math out loud. Red flag 2. She'd asked 2 of Mark's cousins for bridge loans over the years. Always small, always paid back quickly, always framed as temporary. I found out later this was a pattern she used to establish a track record of trustworthiness before the bigger ask. Financial fraud investigators call this grooming the mark, the same term used in romance scams. It works the same way inside families. Red flag 3. Diane was fiercely private about her mail and her computer. If you walked into her home office unannounced, she'd close the laptop lid fast every time. Mark always said, "That's just Mom, she's old school private." I wish someone had asked why a retired woman with nothing to hide needed that kind of reflexive secrecy. Red flag 4. She loved to talk about a restaurant, specifically a restaurant she and my late father-in-law had always dreamed of opening, a family Italian place, Rossi's, named for her maiden name. She'd bring it up constantly when she learned I was a trained cook. At first, it felt sweet. Later, I understood it was reconnaissance. Red flag 5. She had an LLC. I didn't know about it until much later, but Diane had quietly registered Rossi Family Ventures LLC with the Arizona Corporation Commission back in 2019, 3 years before she ever mentioned the restaurant idea to us directly. That gap matters enormously to everything that happened next. Red flag 6, and the one that haunts me most. She kept criticizing my cooking right up until the week she asked us for money. Then, suddenly, at one dinner in March 2022, she looked at my braised lamb shanks and said, "Jenna, this is actually restaurant quality." I remember feeling a flush of pride so intense I nearly cried. I didn't clock it as strange that the compliments started exactly when the ask was coming. That's not affection, that's baiting a hook. Then there's one more dinner from that period I need to tell you about, because I didn't understand its significance until much later when Rita laid the whole timeline out in front of me in a conference room with sticky notes covering an entire wall. It was October 2021, the 3rd anniversary of my father-in-law's death. Diane hosted a small, somber dinner. Just family, candles, a photo of him on the mantle. I made his favorite dish, a simple braised as if with root vegetables, because Mark had told me it was the meal his father requested most often growing up. I worked on it for 2 days. I wanted badly to get this one right. Diane ate quietly that night. No criticism, which I remember registering as strange even then, a break in the pattern. Afterward, over decaf coffee, she started talking about how hard it was to be alone, how she sometimes wondered what she was even working toward anymore, how she'd always regretted that she and my father-in-law never got to open their restaurant before you passed. I remember feeling something shift in my chest that night, a kind of tenderness toward her I hadn't felt before. I told her, without thinking much about it, that if she ever wanted to actually pursue that dream, I'd help however I could. I had the training, I had the experience. I meant it as comfort. I know now, because Rita's timeline confirmed it, that this dinner came 4 months after Diane had maxed out her second credit card and 11 months after she'd met Rick Alvarez on that dating app. She wasn't grieving a lost dream that night. She was auditioning me for a role in a con that had already been quietly under construction for 2.5 years. I offered myself up to her that night, and she simply waited 5 more months for the right moment to collect. That's the part of this story I have the hardest time forgiving. Not the money, honestly. The fact that my genuine love for a grieving woman, my genuine desire to make her feel less alone, was the exact lever she used to pull off the whole thing. Between that October dinner and the actual pitch the following April, Diane did something I have to give her credit for, in the darkest possible sense. She built infrastructure. She wasn't just talking, she was constructing the appearance of a real business, methodically over 6 months. She got a business license. She opened a business checking account, the one that would later show that suspiciously low $41,209.17 balance. She commissioned that logo. She scouted and photographed 3 different vacant commercial spaces in the Phoenix metro area, eventually settling on the Scottsdale location as her centerpiece prop, even though, as we'd later confirm, she never once submitted a formal lease application with intent to sign. She also, during this period, started being noticeably nicer to me. Not obviously so. Diane was too skilled for obvious, but the frequency of the cooking insults dropped by maybe half. Over those 6 months, I remember mentioning to Mark, almost hopefully, that I thought his mom and I were finally clicking. He agreed. We were both, in our own ways, being carefully managed. It happened over dinner. Of course it did, in April 2022. Diane had invited just the 4 of us, her, Mark, me, and Mark's younger sister, Colleen. She'd made a whole presentation, printouts, a binder even, with a mock-up logo for Rossi's Trattoria and photos of a vacant restaurant space in Scottsdale she said she'd already looked at. Her pitch was this. She had $80,000 of her late husband's life insurance sitting untouched. She wanted to finally open the restaurant she and my father-in-law always talked about. She wanted me to be head chef and part owner. She wanted Mark to help with the business side, bookkeeping, contracts, whatever an engineer's brain could bring to a restaurant launch. And she needed us to put in $150,000 combined, our savings, plus a home equity line of credit against our house to get to the total build-out and opening costs, which she said would run close to $310,000 once you counted her own contribution, a small business loan she said she'd already secured, and our piece. She had answers for everything. She showed us a lease term sheet. She showed us a contractor's rough bid. She showed us, at one point, a screenshot of what she said was a business bank account with a balance in the 60,000s. I want to be honest with you. Some part of me wanted this so badly, I didn't ask the questions I should have. A restaurant of my own with my mother-in-law's approval and my husband's support. After years of being told my food was certainly seasoned, it felt like vindication. It felt like the moment I'd finally win. Mark, to his credit, asked more questions than I did that night. He asked to see the LLC formation documents. Diane said her lawyer, a family friend named Gary Pruitt, was handling all of that and would send everything over once the paperwork settles. She asked us not to mention the details to other relatives yet. I don't want Aunt Carol getting jealous, you know how she is, which, again, should have been a flag. Secrecy requests dressed up in family drama are one of the oldest tools in the affinity fraud playbook. We signed nothing that night, but 3 weeks later, after 2 more dinners, both of which involved Diane praising my cooking in a way that felt almost engineered, because it was, we wired $60,000 as a first tranche. 2 months after that, we opened a HELOC against our house for $90,000 more and wired that too. $150,000 gone from our accounts and into Rossi Family Ventures, LLC between May and August of 2022. We were told the build-out would begin that fall. Groundbreaking, permits orders, kitchen equipment orders, all coming any week now. We had no idea we had just funded the final act of a scheme Diane had been running in one form or another for over 3 years. Fall 2022 came and went. No groundbreaking. Diane said there were permit delays with the city. I called Scottsdale's permitting office myself in November, gave him the address of the vacant retail space Diane had shown us, and was told, politely but clearly, that no permit application existed for that address under any name resembling Rossi's, Diane's LLC, or ours. That was the first crack. I didn't tell Mark right away. I told myself I'd misunderstood something, that maybe the application was under the landlord's name or the contractor's. I called the city back 2 more times over the next month to be sure. Same answer every time. Nothing filed. By December 2022, at Christmas dinner, I asked Diane directly, as gently as I could, what the holdup was. She got a look on her face I'd never seen before. Not sad, not defensive, just flat, calculating, cold for about half a second before the warmth came back on like a light switch. "Contractors," she said, "you know how they are. Everything takes longer than they promise." Then she looked at the ham I'd made and said it was a little dry, honestly, dear, and the conversation moved on. I sat with that dinner for a long time afterward. The whiplash of it, being lied to about a third of $1 million restaurant and then criticized for a ham in the same 11 minutes, is when something in me finally, truly started to shift from trusting daughter-in-law to something closer to a witness taking notes. There's a small detail from that fall of 2022 that I glossed over the first time I told this story to Priya, and she stopped me and said, "Go back. Tell me about the contractor." It turned out to matter more than I realized. Diane had told us repeatedly that a contractor named Dave had been handling the build-out timeline. Dave had, according to Diane, given a bid, signed on for the project, and was just waiting on permits before breaking ground. In October 2022, frustrated with the lack of movement, I asked Diane directly for Dave's contact information so I could call him myself and ask about the timeline as someone with professional kitchen design experience. Diane hesitated, visibly on a phone call, in a way I could hear even without seeing her face, and said Dave was hard to reach, always out on other jobs, but she'd have him call me. He never did. I asked 4 more times over the following 2 months. I never got a phone number, an email, a business name, or a last name. Dave did not, as far as any of our subsequent investigation could determine, exist as a real licensed contractor connected to this project in any capacity. He was, Rita told us later, almost certainly a name Diane invented on the spot during that first pitch dinner and then had to keep alive, awkwardly, for months, the way any lie. Requires increasingly elaborate maintenance the longer it survives contact with follow-up questions. I think about Dave a lot, honestly. Not because he was the most damaging part of the fraud, he wasn't, but because he's such a perfect small example of how these schemes actually work in practice. Not one grand, flawless deception, but dozens of small, improvised lies told under pressure that mostly hold together only because the people being lied to loved the liar too much to push hard enough to make them fall apart. In January 2023, I asked Diane for the LLC's operating agreement and a copy of the business bank statements, reasonable requests for anyone who'd put $150,000 into a business. She stalled for 3 weeks. When she finally sent something, it was a single-page PDF that looked, to my untrained eye, slightly off. The font on the LLC letterhead didn't match the Arizona Corporation Commission's standard filing template. The bank statement she sent showed a balance of $41,209.17, nowhere close to what should have been left after our $150,000 contribution, plus her supposed $80,000, minus whatever deposits and fees she claimed to have already paid. And that's when I found the smoking gun. Sort of. A first one, anyway. There would be others. I ran a public record search. Anyone can do this, by the way. It's free on most Secretary of State websites, on Rossi Family Ventures, LLC, through the Arizona Corporation Commission's online portal. The formation date wasn't 2022, when Diane pitched it to us as a brand new venture. It was filed on March 14, 2019. 3 years before her big family dinner presentation. 3 years before she ever mentioned it to me or Mark. I sat in my car in a grocery store parking lot for almost 20 minutes staring at that filing date on my phone. A business that supposedly existed to fulfill a dream she'd only just decided to pursue had actually been quietly registered years earlier. Something didn't add up, and my gut told me it wasn't a clerical mistake. I called Mark's sister Colleen that week, carefully because I still didn't fully trust my own read on the situation, and I didn't want to blow up a family over a hunch. Colleen went quiet on the phone for a long moment, and then she told me something that changed everything. In 2019, the same year that LLC was formed, Colleen and her husband had given Diane $22,000 towards startup costs for what Diane had told them at the time was a small catering business, not a restaurant, a catering business that Diane said she wanted to run out of a commercial kitchen space near her home. Colleen said the catering business just kind of never happened. Diane returned $4,000 of it over the following year in small increments, called the rest an investment in the family, don't worry about it, and the subject quietly dropped. Colleen had never told Mark or me. She said she'd felt embarrassed and honestly a little afraid of how intense her mother got when questioned about money. That was the second victim I'd found. It would not be the last. Over the following month, I started reaching out, carefully, quietly, to other relatives. What I found built a picture that made my $150,000 loss look almost like a chapter in a much longer book. Diane's late husband's brother, my father-in-law's brother Frank, had loaned Diane $15,000 in 2018 after she told him she needed help with unexpected medical bills. Bank statements later showed Diane had no unusual medical expenses that year. A family friend, Marjorie, who'd known Diane for over 30 years through their church, had put $30,000 into what Diane described to her as a real estate flip opportunity in 2020. Marjorie never saw a property, a contract, or her money again. And Colleen's $22,000, which was actually closer to $18,000 net after the partial repayment. Adding it up, my $150,000, Frank's $15,000, Marjorie's $30,000, and Colleen's net $18,000, I was looking at over $213,000 taken from people who loved and trusted Diane across at least 5 years using at least 3 different cover stories, funneled largely through the same LLC and a personal checking account at a regional bank. The emotional toll was, honestly, worse than the number. Mark stopped sleeping. He'd go quiet for hours, then suddenly angry, then guilty, cycling through it like grief because, in a real sense, it was grief. He was mourning the mother he thought he had. I watched my husband, a steady, logical engineer, become someone who flinched every time his phone rang with his mother's name on the screen. And I was still going to Sunday dinners, sitting across from her, cooking for her, listening to her tell me my sauce needed salt, while I now knew, or strongly suspected, that she'd taken our life savings under false pretenses. Before the confrontation, I want to walk you through something I did in late January 2023 that turned out to matter enormously later. I started saving everything. Every text from Diane about the restaurant, screenshotted and backed up to a separate cloud folder. Every email, every voicemail transcribed by hand into a notebook with the date and time written at the top. This wasn't strategic at first, it was just what a person does when their gut is telling them something is wrong and their brain hasn't caught up yet. But by the time Priya, our attorney, asked us for documentation months later, I had a folder with over 340 individual pieces of correspondence, organized by month, each one time-stamped by the platform it came from. One exchange in particular became central to the case. On November 3rd, 2022, I texted Diane asking specifically, "Can you send the permit filing number so I can check status with the city?" Her response 20 minutes later, "Gary has it. I'll get it from him this week." I have 13 subsequent messages over the following 4 months where I asked variations of the same question. I never received a permit number, because there was never a permit application. Priya later used this exact exchange, blown up on a poster board during settlement negotiations. Sometimes the most damning evidence isn't a smoking gun. It's a woman asking the same reasonable question 13 times and never once getting a real answer. Before we formally retained Rita Delgado as our forensic accountant, we had a free initial consultation with her in February 2023. Just Mark and me, laptop open, spreadsheet on the screen. I remember she looked at our timeline for maybe 10 minutes before she looked up and said, gently, "I want to be honest with you both. This has the shape of something I've seen before. I don't think there's a restaurant." Mark asked her what she meant. Rita explained that in her 15 years doing forensic work, family investment fraud almost always follows one of 3 templates: the real estate flip that never closes, the small business that never opens, or the guaranteed investment fund with no public registration. All 3 share a signature feature. The victim is shown just enough documentation to feel reassured, but never given full, independently verifiable access to the underlying accounts. If she'd shown you a real, complete bank statement with a real routing and account number and let you call the bank directly to verify the balance, Rita said, that would tell me something different. A screenshot doesn't tell me anything except that someone knows how to use Photoshop, or doesn't even need to, because most people never check. That consultation is the moment I stopped hoping I was wrong. In February 2023, Mark and I confronted her directly, calmly, at her kitchen table, no dinner this time. We asked to see the real bank statements for the LLC, going back to formation. We asked about the discrepancy in the filing date. We asked where our $150,000 actually was. Diane cried. She said we were attacking her during the hardest year of her life. She said the restaurant was delayed because of a contractor dispute she hadn't wanted to worry us with. She said the 2019 filing date was just when Gary set up the paperwork. These things sit dormant for years. It doesn't mean anything. She refused to produce full bank statements, saying it was an invasion of her privacy and that families don't need lawyers to trust each other. She also, in the same conversation, told me that my questioning her was exactly the kind of aggressive energy that had always made her a little worried about me as a partner for her son. That, right there, is when I understood exactly what kind of person I was dealing with. Redirect, deflect, then attack the accuser's character. It's a script. I've since learned it's almost always the same script, whether it's a mother-in-law or a Ponzi scheme operator on the news. We left that night with nothing resolved and $150,000 still gone. Over the following weeks, we discovered, through Gary Pruitt's assistant, who turned out to be far more forthcoming than Gary himself, and eventually through subpoenaed records, some of how Diane had covered her tracks. She had, in fact, spent real money on the appearance of legitimacy: a $1,200 logo design, a $2,000 lease application fee for the Scottsdale space that she let lapse without ever signing a lease, and roughly $4,000 on the printed binder materials and mock-ups she'd shown us that first pitch dinner. That's it. Out of $213,000 plus taken across multiple family members, roughly $7,200 went toward anything resembling actual restaurant development. The rest had gone somewhere else entirely, and at that point, in early 2023, we still didn't know where. Diane had also, we later confirmed, forwarded a doctored bank statement to us using a mail merge trick, copying real bank header-head formatting from an old statement and pasting in a fabricated balance. It's shockingly easy to do and shockingly hard to catch unless you know exactly what you're looking for. I didn't, not yet, but I was about to learn. By March 2023, Mark and I made a decision that would change the next year of our lives. We stopped asking Diane for answers, and we started building a case. I want to be clear about something. I am not a lawyer, not an accountant, not a forensic investigator. I was a kitchen manager who liked spreadsheets more than the average line cook. What turned me into someone capable of building a fraud case against my own mother-in-law was mostly stubbornness, a legal tad, and a willingness to spend my evenings doing something other than crying about it. The first thing I did was build a timeline. Every dollar, every date, every conversation, every text message, laid out in a spreadsheet with columns for date, amount, method, wire, check, Venmo, source account, destination account, and story given at the time. That last column ended up being the most damning because Diane's stories didn't stay consistent. The restaurant timeline shifted 5 separate times across our texts and emails. Contractors changed names twice. The small business loan she claimed to have secured was never named, never sourced, never documented anywhere. We hired a forensic accountant in April 2023. Her name was Rita Delgado, and I cannot overstate how much of this recovery happened because of her. Rita specialized in exactly this kind of case, family financial abuse and affinity fraud, where the perpetrator and victim share holidays. Rita's first move was to request, through our attorney, full banking records for Rossi Family Ventures, LLC, via a subpoena once we filed a civil complaint. I'll get to that. And to trace every wire we'd sent using the wire confirmation numbers our bank provided. Here's what she found, laid out over roughly 6 weeks of work. Of our $150,000, $61,000 had gone to a personal line of credit payoff, a Chase card and a Discover card in Diane's name, both maxed out, both carrying balances that had been building since at least 2020. $34,000 had gone toward a timeshare maintenance fee dispute and a lump sum payout to a timeshare exit company. Diane had gotten trapped in a predatory timeshare years earlier and had been quietly bleeding money trying to get out of it. $22,000 had gone to a man named Rick Alvarez, whom none of us in the family had ever heard of. The remaining roughly $33,000 had been withdrawn in cash in increments under $10,000, a pattern Rita immediately flagged because withdrawals structured to stay just under the $10,000 threshold that triggers a bank's currency transaction report are a classic sign of someone trying to avoid federal reporting scrutiny. That's not an accident, that's intent. And that's when I found the smoking gun. Rick Alvarez turned out to be a man Diane had met on a senior singles dating app roughly 18 months after my father-in-law died. Public records and a private investigator Rita brought in confirmed Rick had at least 2 prior instances in 2 different states where women in their 60s and 70s had reported similar patterns to consumer protection agencies. A relationship, then requests for money for business opportunities or temporary emergencies, followed by Rick disappearing for months at a time and reappearing when funds ran low. Diane hadn't just stolen from us to open a restaurant that never existed. She had, at least in part, been funneling family money to a man who was very possibly running his own romance-adjacent financial exploitation scheme on her, while she ran her own scheme on us. It's a genuinely disorienting thing to realize your mother-in-law may have been simultaneously a perpetrator and, in some narrower sense, a victim herself. The law, as you'll see, did not find that distinction to be a defense. Through Rita and our attorney, we formally documented statements from Colleen, from Frank, and from Marjorie. Each of them, once they understood they weren't alone, was far more willing to come forward. There's real power in numbers here. I want to say this directly to anyone watching who thinks they're the only person a family member has done this to. You are very likely not alone, and finding the others is often the single most important step in building a case anyone will take seriously. We also pulled Diane's Facebook history using a public records tool and screenshots family members had saved. Over 4 years, she had posted photos from 2 international trips, a new car, and, this one stung, a photo captioned, "Treating myself, finally, after everything," showing a designer handbag, purchased with a card linked to an account Rita later traced $6,400 into. In the same month, our second wire transfer of $90,000 landed in the LLC account. I want to slow down for a moment on Marjorie, because out of everyone Diane hurt, her story affected me the most, and it's the one that made this stop feeling like our family problem and start feeling like something bigger that I had a responsibility to help fix. Marjorie was 71, a retired school teacher, widowed like Diane, and the two of them had been close for over 3 decades through their church. When I finally sat down with her at her kitchen table in April 2023, she cried almost immediately. Not about the $30,000, she told me, but about the betrayal. "I sat with her at her husband's funeral," Marjorie said. "I brought her casseroles for a month. I trusted her with my Bob's memory the way you trust maybe 3 people in your whole life." Marjorie had given Diane the money in 2020 during the pandemic for what Diane describes as a real estate flip opportunity, a distressed property Diane said she and a partner were buying below market to renovate and resell, with Marjorie's contribution earning a guaranteed 15% return within 8 months. There was no property, there was no partner. There was, Rita's investigation later confirmed, a single wire transfer that went directly into Diane's personal checking account and was spent down within 11 weeks, primarily on credit card payments and a Caribbean cruise Diane took in early 2021. The same trip that appeared in a Facebook album captioned, "Needed this after such a hard year." Marjorie became, in many ways, the emotional backbone of our case. Detectives and prosecutors, I learned, respond differently to an elderly widow who lost her retirement security than they sometimes do to a younger married couple who should have known better. That's not fair, and Priya said as much, but it's real, and Marjorie's willingness to go on record with police made an enormous difference in how quickly the Financial Crimes Unit took the whole file seriously. I mentioned earlier that our final complaint package ran to 214 pages. I want to give you a sense of what actually went into that, because I think it's genuinely useful for anyone watching who might need to build something like this someday. It included a master timeline spreadsheet cross-referencing every dollar against dates, methods, and stated purposes, full wire transfer confirmations from our bank obtained through formal records requests, screenshots and printouts of all 340-plus saved communications, Rita's 22-page forensic accounting report tracing fund flows across 5 bank accounts and 1 LLC, notarized witness statements from Colleen, Frank, and Marjorie, public records printouts showing the true 2019 LLC formation date against the 2022 pitch date, county property records showing the attempted trust transfer, and a section Priya insisted on adding at the end, a 2-page narrative summary written in plain English because, she said, prosecutors are human beings with 300 open files, and the file that's easiest to understand gets moved to the top of the pile. That narrative summary, more than any spreadsheet, is what I think finally got Detective Ruiz to pick up the phone and call us back in under a week. In May 2023, we retained a civil litigation attorney, Priya Nair, who specialized in fraud and breach of fiduciary duty cases. Priya explained that we had several legal avenues and that pursuing more than one at once, civil and criminal, often produces the strongest pressure and the best odds of actual recovery. On the civil side, Priya filed suit against Diane and Rossi Family Ventures LLC for fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and unjust enrichment, seeking the return of our $150,000 plus damages. Civil suits have a lower burden of proof than criminal cases, preponderance of the evidence, meaning more likely than not, rather than beyond a reasonable doubt, which made this the faster path toward a judgment, even if enforcing that judgment would take longer. On the criminal side, Priya helped us prepare a detailed complaint package, the timeline, the spreadsheet, Rita's forensic report, the witness statements, and we filed reports with two separate agencies. First, the local police department's financial crimes unit, which in most jurisdictions is where elder to family or family affinity fraud gets its first look. Second, because the wire transfers had crossed state lines, our bank was headquartered out of state, this potentially triggered federal wire fraud statutes. So we also filed a complaint with the FBI's Internet Crime Complaint Center, IC3, and with the Federal Trade Commission through reportfraud.ftc.gov, which routes complaints into a shared law enforcement database even when the FTC itself doesn't prosecute individual cases. I remember Priya telling us something that stuck with me. Family fraud cases get taken less seriously than stranger fraud historically. That's changing, but you have to build the files so thoroughly that no investigator can wave it off as a family dispute. So we did. Our final complaint package to law enforcement ran to 214 pages. I won't pretend this went smoothly. There were at least 3 points where it looked like Diane might simply get away with it. Near miss 1. In June 2023, Diane transferred the deed on her townhouse to a trust with Rick Alvarez listed as a secondary beneficiary. A move Priya said looked a lot like an attempt to shield the one significant asset she still had ahead of any judgment against her. We only caught this because Rita had set up a standing alert on county property records. Priya moved quickly to file a lis pendens, a legal notice that flags a property as subject to pending litigation, which effectively froze Diane's ability to sell or fully transfer the townhouse while our case was active. Near miss 2. In August 2023, Diane's LLC bank account, the one still holding roughly $9,000, was drained to zero 2 days before Rita's subpoena for records was set to be served. Diane claimed she'd used it for legal fees. Bank records eventually showed the money had gone as a cash withdrawal, again structured under $10,000, the day the funds hit. We couldn't recover that specific $9,000 directly, but Rita's documentation of the pattern, 3 prior similarly structured withdrawals plus this one, became a key piece of evidence for prosecutors later because structuring cash withdrawals to evade reporting requirements is itself a federal crime under 31 U.S.C. Section 5324, separate from the underlying fraud. Near miss 3. And the scariest one. In October 2023, Diane's attorney, not Gary Pruitt anymore, she'd hired a criminal defense attorney by this point, reached out with a settlement offer of $15,000, final and full, in exchange for us dropping the civil suit and implicitly going quiet with law enforcement. For about 48 hours, exhausted and drained from 6 months of fighting, Mark and I actually considered it. $15,000 felt, in a dark moment, like it might be worth just making the pain stop. We said no, partly because $15,000 was insulting against $150,000 in verified losses, but mostly because of Marjorie, 71 years old, who had lost $30,000 of her retirement savings and had exactly 0 leverage to ever get it back without our case moving forward too. Settling quietly would have meant Diana walked away from every other victim as well. We told Priya to reject the offer and keep pushing toward trial. That decision, more than any single piece of evidence, is the one I'm proudest of in this whole story. By November 2023, the local financial crimes detective assigned to our case, Detective Ruiz, called to tell us the district attorney's office was reviewing our file for formal charges. The FBI, separately, had connected our IC3 complaint with 2 other complaints against Science LLC and against Rick Alvarez individually, filed by victims in other states connected to his prior romance scam pattern. Our small family fraud case had become part of a larger, multi-state financial crimes review. We were, finally, no longer alone in this fight. In January 2024, the district attorney's office filed criminal charges against Diane, 2 counts of fraudulent schemes and artifices, 1 count of forgery for the doctored bank statement, and 1 count of structuring transactions to evade reporting requirements. Because the wire transfers crossed state lines, federal prosecutors also filed a parallel wire fraud charge under 18 U.S.C. 1343, which carries a potential penalty of up to 20 years per count, though realistic sentencing in cases like this, especially for a first-time offender with no prior record, tends to be far lower, often probation combined with restitution or a modest custodial sentence measured in months rather than years, unless the amounts or victim count are especially severe. Diane was arraigned in February 2024. I sat 2 rows behind the prosecution table. She did not look at me once. She wore a cardigan I recognized. She'd worn it to my wedding. Our civil case moved faster than the criminal one, as they often do. In March 2024, facing overwhelming documentary evidence, Rita's forensic report, the wire confirmations, the doctored bank statement, the witness testimony from Colleen, Frank, and Marjorie, Diane's civil attorney recommended she accept a consent judgment rather than go to trial and risk a larger jury verdict plus attorney's fees. The consent judgment, $150,000 in principal, plus $18,400 in prejudgment interest, plus $22,000 in attorney's fees and court costs we'd incurred building the case, for a total civil judgment of $190,400 against Diane personally and against Rossi Family Ventures, LLC. Getting a judgment and actually collecting a judgment are 2 very different things, and Priya was clear with us about that from day one. This is where the lis pendens on the townhouse mattered enormously. With her home now effectively frozen and her legal bills mounting, Diane's attorney negotiated a structured settlement. The townhouse would be sold, with proceeds first satisfying our judgment up to the full amount, then addressing Colleen's, Frank's, and Marjorie's separate judgments, because by this point, all 3 had filed their own civil suits, each represented by Priya's firm, consolidated for efficiency. The townhouse sold in June 2024 for $412,000. After the existing mortgage payoff and closing costs, roughly $267,000 in equity was released. Our full $190,400 was paid first in accordance with the priority established by our earlier filed lis pendens. The remainder was split, prorated, among Colleen, Frank, and Marjorie's judgments, not making any of them fully whole, but recovering roughly 70 cents on the dollar for each of them, which Rita told us was, frankly, an unusually good outcome for family fraud recovery. Most victims in these cases recover far less, or nothing at all. In September 2024, facing the civil judgment already entered against her, the forensic accounting trail, and mounting pressure from the multi-state federal review connecting her to the Rick Alvarez investigation, Diane accepted a plea agreement, guilty to 1 count of fraudulent schemes and artifices and 1 count of structuring, with the forgery and federal wire fraud charges dismissed as part of the deal, a common prosecutorial trade-off to secure a guaranteed conviction without the cost and uncertainty of trial. She was sentenced in November 2024 to 18 months of home confinement with electronic monitoring, 5 years of probation, and court-ordered restitution, largely already satisfied by the civil judgment proceeds, but formally entered into the criminal record as well, which matters because criminal restitution orders don't disappear in bankruptcy the way some civil debts can. She also lost her standing in the local bridge club, her Thursday social circle, once the local news ran a short piece on the sentencing. Local woman sentenced in family fraud scheme involving fake restaurant. Public shame isn't a court-ordered penalty, but I won't pretend it didn't feel like its own kind of justice. I want to go back and give you the full scene of that February 2024 arraignment because it's the moment this story stopped feeling like a private family wound and started feeling like something the world had officially agreed was a crime. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. Fluorescent lighting, government beige walls, a bailiff who looked bored until the case was called. Diane walked in wearing that cardigan, flanked by her criminal defense attorney, a sharp, quiet man named Everett Boyle, who I later learned specialized almost exclusively in white-collar defense. She looked older than I remembered, smaller. The judge read the charges aloud: fraudulent schemes and artifices, forgery, structuring, in the flat, procedural voice judges use for exactly this purpose, so that the gravity of the words doesn't get lost in theater. Diane pled not guilty at that stage, which is standard, a placeholder plea while her attorney negotiated behind the scenes. The whole hearing took under 9 minutes. Mark gripped my hand through the entire thing. Colleen sat on his other side. Frank had driven 3 hours to be there. Marjorie couldn't make it, her hip had been bothering her, but she'd asked us to text her the moment it was over, and I did, standing in the courthouse hallway, both of us crying on the phone together. The restitution hearing, held alongside sentencing in November 2024, is where the numbers finally became official, on the record, in a way that felt different from even the civil judgment. The prosecutor read out the full restitution figure, by that point mostly already satisfied through the townhouse sale proceeds. But the act of a judge formally ordering it, name by name, victim by victim, Jenna and Mark, Colleen, Frank, Marjorie, felt like something no spreadsheet had given me. It felt like the system, slow and imperfect as it had been, finally saying out loud, "This happened, and it was wrong, and here is the accounting of it." Diane's attorney asked for leniency, citing her age, her lack of prior criminal record, and what he called a genuine, if misguided, desire to provide for her family. The prosecutor countered with the structuring evidence, Rita's documentation of the pattern of under $10,000 cash withdrawals, arguing that deliberate evasion of federal reporting requirements undercut any claim that this was simple, misguided generosity. The judge, in the end, split the difference: home confinement rather than incarceration, but 5 years of probation, a formal criminal record, and restitution obligations that survive even in the event of future bankruptcy filings. Here's the twist I promised you at the beginning, the part of this story that changed how I understood the entire thing. Rita's forensic work eventually traced the fuller picture of where money had gone across the 5+ years Diane had been running variations of this scheme. Not just our $150,000, but the earlier funds from Colleen, Frank, and Marjorie, too. It wasn't really about a restaurant at all. It had never really been about a restaurant. Diane had spent nearly 6 years slowly, quietly going broke. Credit card debt from years of trying to maintain a lifestyle that outpaced her actual pension, a predatory timeshare she couldn't escape, and eventually a man who exploited her loneliness for cash, the same way she exploited our trust for cash. She wasn't funding a dream, she was funding a slow-motion collapse, and using her family, using me specifically, because my professional cooking skills gave her the perfect emotionally resonant cover story as the mechanism to keep the collapse from becoming visible. The cruelest part, the part that took me the longest to sit with. Every single insult about my cooking, every certainly seasoned, every a bit much, every quiet dismissal at every family dinner for 6 years. I now believe, and Rita agrees this fits the pattern she's seen in other cases, was never really about my food. It was about making sure I never felt confident enough to ask the hard questions. A woman who believes her cooking is a joke doesn't usually think to ask for a forensic accountant. Diane needed me small. My food was never the target. My confidence was. I've focused a lot on Mark's and my own financial recovery, but I want to give a fuller picture of what happened for Colleen, Frank, and Marjorie too, because their stories matter just as much. And because part of what made this whole process meaningful was watching each of them get some measure of justice, not just us. Colleen, whose net loss came to roughly $18,000, recovered approximately $12,600 through the prorated townhouse sale distribution, about 70 cents on the dollar, consistent with what Rita had predicted. She since told me that the money mattered less to her than finally having her mother acknowledge, even indirectly through a legal document, that what happened to her wasn't imagined or exaggerated. For years, she said, she'd half convinced herself she'd misunderstood the original catering business conversation. The court record ended that doubt permanently. Frank, at 79 years old, recovered roughly $10,500 of his original $15,000 loan. He used part of it, he told us at Thanksgiving last year, to finally take the fishing trip to Alaska he'd been putting off since his wife passed. Diane always said there'd be time for that later, he said. Turns out, later doesn't wait around for anybody. Marjorie recovered approximately $21,000 of her original $30,000. It didn't fully restore her retirement cushion, but combined with some adjustments to her Social Security claiming strategy that Priya's firm helped connect her with pro bono financial counseling to figure out, she told me last spring that she finally feels secure again. She still goes to the same church. Diane, notably, does not anymore. We got our $150,000 back, plus interest, in full by August 2024. We used the portion of it to pay off the HELOC we'd opened, restoring our home equity. We put the rest back into savings, this time spread across accounts Mark and I both monitored jointly, with alerts set on anything over $500. And, this part matters to me more than the number, in March 2025, I opened a small 10-seat supper club out of a commercial kitchen space here in Denver. Self-funded, no family investors, no binder of promises from anyone but me. It's called Certainly Seasoned. I named it that on purpose. Mark and I still see Diane exactly twice a year now, supervised visits at a neutral restaurant on Mark's insistence more than mine, because he's still working through what it means to have a mother who did this. She has never apologized. At her last supervised lunch, she told me the restaurant's bread was a little dense. I laughed so hard I had to leave the table. Some habits, apparently, never really die, but they don't have power over me anymore either. If you take one thing away from this story, I want it to be this. Financial abuse inside families rarely looks like a stranger with a clipboard scam. It looks like someone you love at a dinner table, being generous with criticism and slow with financial transparency. Here are the warning signs I wish I'd recognized years earlier. 1. Chronic secrecy about someone's own finances paired with confident opinions about yours. People who are financially transparent adjacent, willing to talk numbers, show documents, answer specifics, are usually not the ones running schemes. Evasiveness is data. 2. A pattern of temporary loans to multiple family members over the years, especially ones nobody talks about openly. If you learn a relative has quietly borrowed from 3 different people, that's not bad luck. That's a business model. 3. Any request to keep a financial arrangement private from other family members. Legitimate family investments don't usually require secrecy. Fraud does, because it depends on victims never comparing notes. 4. Pressure that escalates around a personal vulnerability, your pride, your dream, your desire for approval. Scammers, including family ones, target the thing you want most. For me, it was a restaurant and my mother-in-law's respect. Know what your version of that is and be extra skeptical of anyone who suddenly starts offering it right before asking for money. 5. Documents that don't quite check out. Public records, Secretary of State business filings, county property records, court dockets are almost always free and searchable online in the U.S. If someone shows you a business, a property, or a legal document tied to a financial ask, verify it independently before you wire a single dollar. It took me 1 afternoon and $0 to find the LLC filing date that cracked this whole case open. 6. Any financial opportunity that comes bundled with an emotional appeal, a dying wish, a grieving parent, a dream you're being invited to help fulfill. I'm not saying every emotional family request is a scam. Most aren't, obviously. I'm saying that legitimate requests can survive scrutiny, and if someone reacts to reasonable due diligence with hurt feelings or accusations instead of documentation, that reaction itself is information. 7. Structured cash withdrawals or a sudden preference for cash over traceable payments. If a family member starts asking for money in cash or withdrawing suspiciously specific amounts, just under reporting thresholds, that's not thriftiness. That's someone thinking about what a bank or an investigator might notice. And 8, maybe the most important one. If your gut tells you something doesn't add up, it usually doesn't. I spent years overriding my own instincts because I didn't want to believe someone I loved could do this. Don't make my mistake. Trust the math, not the smile. If you're watching this and recognizing pieces of your own life in it, here's the concrete version of what I wish someone had told me in 2022, before I ever wired that first $60,000. Ask for full, verifiable documentation before any money moves. Not screenshots, not summaries. Actual account numbers you can independently confirm with the institution directly. Search public business and property records yourself. It costs nothing and takes an afternoon. If a relative resists a written agreement for a family arrangement, treat that resistance as the answer. Talk to other family members privately before committing money, specifically asking whether anyone else has been approached with something similar. You may find, as I did, that you are not the first. And if you ever do discover a pattern like this, start documenting immediately, even before you're sure. Save texts, save emails, write down dates and phone calls while they're fresh. You may never need that folder, but if you do, you will be very, very glad you built it early instead of trying to reconstruct it from memory after the fact, the way Colleen and Frank and Marjorie had to. Financial recovery is possible. Ours took 14 months from first suspicion to final payment, and it took a forensic accountant, an attorney, 2 law enforcement agencies, and 4 family members willing to say, out loud, that someone they loved had hurt them. It is exhausting. It is also, I promise you, worth it. If you've been through something like this, a family member, a friend, anyone who used trust as a weapon against your money, I want to hear about it. Tell me what happened in the comments. You are not the only one. And telling the story the way I'm telling mine right now is very often the first step toward actually getting your money back. Subscribe for next week's story, and until then, check your bank statements, trust your instincts, and never, ever apologize for asking to see the receipts.